Grinding. If you did a 5-second Google search and skim past the bullshit AI response, you'd likely see the Wikipedia pop culture definition. Grinding is a term used in video game culture referring to the act of repeating an action or set of actions, including non repetitive tasks, to achieve a desired result at a level of certain difficulty, typically for an extended period of time. If you spent any amount of time playing any popular MMO, RPG, or even now FPS games and many other genres, you've likely taken part in grinding. As I'm sure my ancestors are writhing in their graves knowing they spent grueling hours doing backbreaking labor just so I could spend the same time and effort shooting pixels to gain a slightly higher stat piece of gear and inevitably make no visible difference in my performance, I still consider myself one who enjoys this grind. Recently, I've been replaying some grindier games, and I asked myself, why does this grind entice me? I've set out to answer that question so that you don't have to. You see, grinding in video games is no new feat. Grinding in the way we know it has existed in gaming for years now. Games such as RuneScape and World of Warcraft are some long-standing examples that come to mind. These games were not the first to do this, and we certainly have not seen the end to this yet. In order for a grind to be worth it, there is often some driver or motivating factor that leads the player to grind in the first place. Of course, there are intentional grinds given by the developers that give an obvious reward for completing, but these long-term grinds are often much more vague. In many cases, the reason a player is willing to put the time and effort in is largely subjective. More often than not, other players may see no value at all in their effort. Nonetheless, these players continue, marching ever forward as they inch closer and closer to the extreme dump of dopamine that they so desperately seek. I suppose that's it. At the end of the day, we can find a genuine reason for this grind, can't we? But is dopamine really a reason on its own? We see a similar theory for gambling addictions. The drive to gamble is motivated by the rush they feel each time, even when repeated attempts don't bring you any closer to winning. They continue because they feel so stimulated during these attempts. I believe this is certainly one possible explanation, perhaps a more intrinsically motivated one at that. But naturally, we must also account for extrinsic motivators. What a player is grinding in the first place can potentially be motivation enough, given that the reward itself is deemed to be worth it by them. Sure, it may not be fun to shoot the same enemy time and time again, but the mindset of it'll all be worth it when this drops can alleviate some of this strife. This does pose the question, is grinding addictive in the same way as gambling? Oftentimes players are grinding this gear, and they do not get any closer to obtaining it even after countless attempts. You could even argue that the grinding for new gear on its own is a form of gambling. But I'd like to focus on the intrinsic for now, as it is less obvious and more interesting in my opinion. In our society, we often seek many sources of stimulation. We thrive on stimulation as it keeps us ever entertained. Almost everyone has unique leisure activities that stimulate them in this way. As I prefer playing video games, listening to music, and making creative projects, many others may enjoy mountain climbing or outdoors activities such as kayaking. These all stimulate in very similar ways, which drives us to continue doing them. Please don't misunderstand though, I'm not saying that these activities are inherently bad or dangerous, but I believe there is something to be said about some of them. When we find people in our society who are thrill seekers or adrenaline junkies, we typically think of those who jump headfirst into danger and dive out of planes just for the fun of it. But can this same rush be obtained somewhere else? The reward center of the brain involved the previously mentioned chemical dopamine. Of course, there are many other chemicals involved, causing various reactions, but dopamine is at the forefront and will be the star of this discussion. It's dopamine that helps our nerve cells communicate and produces positive sensations that earned it the nickname of the feel-good hormone in the first place. Now, historically, dopamine was likely sparked when we discovered fire or didn't starve to death after 5 minutes or whatever the fuck previous civilizations had to celebrate. Now, however, dopamine is rightfully earned from a 15-hour play session resulting in widespread health lapses and several blood clots within your legs. Now that our society finally has its priorities in order, we've decided to take advantage of this knowledge of dopamine. Now, more than ever, quick hits of dopamine are always accessible. Social media apps such as Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and plenty of games give these dopamine rushes as the short form content quickly excites your brain, allowing you to swipe until you are properly stimulated and continue swiping until you are no longer. So, given all this information, you'd likely think I find grinding in video games to be equally problematic and unhealthy. But I actually believe that it may be beneficial after all. While it's not exactly a fair one-to-one comparison, grinding in video games acts as a polar opposite to these apps. I'll be referencing a well-known study known as the Marshmallow Experiment. If you're unfamiliar, I'll briefly summarize. In the Marshmallow Experiment, children were presented marshmallows with the option to eat one now, or delay their gratification and wait until the researcher came back in the room where they would receive 2 marshmallows to eat them both. You've likely also heard this referenced in the common analogy, would you rather have $10 now or $100 a month from now? It's a similar study, just wanted to reference that. The goal of this study was to assess the effect of delayed gratification in children on success later in their life. It was found that those children who had the potential to wait or delay their gratification were much more successful academically. I bring this study up to say that grinding in this way may be indicative of delaying your gratification. Instead of settling for what you have and caving, you spend hours on end for an improvement you deem to be worth waiting for. In a sense, it is identical to the marshmallow. Video games have become more widely accommodating than ever, offering choices of play to audiences of all interests and backgrounds, and with so many options there are constantly ways to remain stimulated, and yet you choose to continue your hunt. You are committed, you are the go-getter among go-getters, and it brings a tear to my eye to see you grind. But as we come to the end of the discussion, I believe it is important to know. At what point does the grind become counterproductive? Are you truly delaying your gratification, or are you simply continuing to play as a form of escapism? Do you want that increase in damage, or is there something truly real you can't stand to face? I say this not to shame you, but to make you self-aware. And with that, we close this discussion with possibly more questions than when we opened it. Why do we farm so constantly? I suppose the most popular answer is the answer to all great questions of psychology. It depends. Whether or not you see fit to grind countless hours for a micro improvement that incrementally increases your damage in a way that no one else will notice but you, are you truly addicted? Or do you simply enjoy it? Is it innocent or troubling? Truly, this depends on your circumstances. In my opinion, I play video games and grind because I enjoy it. But who knows? Am I simply addicted? Could I really stop if I wanted to? Only time will tell.